Okay, so good morning, everyone. I think we're about ready to start. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this morning's webinar, where we'll be discussing a new ESRI report comparing productivity levels in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I should say at the outset, this is part of a series of reports that we've been writing in collaboration with our colleagues in the Shared Island Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach. And I guess the program's been running for about two years now. And the sort of the philosophy underpinning it, as far as I sort of read it anyway, there's sort of two strands to the work. One has been thinking about the island of Ireland and asking questions about whether or not we can do more collaboratively on the island for the benefits of all citizens. And then a second strand has been to take advantage of this unusual situation that we have this small island of ours, and we have two ways of doing things, north and south. And it seems like a really good opportunity to learn about what works and what doesn't work. So generally, the spirit of this program is about sort of learning, sharing ideas, all with a view to making sort of better policy for the citizens north and south on the island. So this morning's another important study. Productivity, just one of those issues that I think consumes more and more attention internationally. So good that we're talking about it here on a sort of a more localized level. So in a moment, I'll be inviting one of the authors of the report, Adele Bergen, who'll take you through the details, and Seamus McGuinness, co-author, is with us too. And then a little bit later on, delighted to say, David Jordan from the Queen's University in Belfast has joined us. David, I know you've been writing about productivity in Northern Ireland for quite a while, so it's really good to get your insights on this issue, and we'll hear from you a little bit later on. So it's a pretty short event this morning. We should be done by noon. So on the assumption that Adele and David stay to the sort of allotted time, we should be able to take some questions and answers before our session is up. And so as the event continues, if people want to put questions into the Q&A function, I'll try and feed them then on to the authors, or indeed to David as well, who would be welcome to contribute. So I think that's all we need for the time being, apart from just welcoming everybody again, and then Adele, handing over to you.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I think, yeah, great. Thanks for sharing my slides there. So as Alan mentioned, this is joint work with my colleague Seamus McGuinness on productivity in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it's research that we undertook as part of our research program with the Shared Island Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach. So can we move on to the next slide? So why does productivity matter? Well, there's a nice quote about this from Paul Krugman. Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. So we know that productivity is a key driver of economic growth and living standards. The existing evidence for Northern Ireland tells us that productivity in the north tends to lag the UK average. And then for Ireland, Ireland is often classified as a high productivity economy, but we know that because of FDI related distortions, that really complicates the measurement of Irish economic activity. Essentially, it can overstate Irish productivity. From a north-south perspective, up until recently, there was in general very little comparative north-south research, including on productivity. Typically, research would benchmark the Northern Ireland economy against regions in Great Britain, and the Irish economy has tended to be compared with the UK as a whole or with other EU countries, but that's changing. And in recent years, we've seen, a big increase in north-south research. And there is some evidence that points to a substantial productivity gap that favors Ireland. So this work done by John Fitzgerald and Edgar Morgenroth, myself and Seamus have a couple of papers, and also by McFlynn. And all of these papers point to a productivity gap, but they don't really explain it. They offer explanations including gaps in educational attainment, differences in FDI quality and intensity, differences in exports, in export intensity, and so on. Next slide. So in this research, we examine sectoral productivity in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we look at some trends over time, and then we formally modeled the determinants of productivity separately in Ireland and Northern Ireland, so that we can identify the key factors that drive productivity in each region. So in terms of methods, we use a fixed effects estimator, and that means we can factor out biases related to unobserved factors that remain relatively constant over time that might impact productivity. So a good example here would be infrastructural assets such as airports or ports. And so overall then this gives us sort of more robust estimates compared to models such as use say cross-sectional or pooled data. We then also use a separate modeling approach, a decomposition, to measure the extent to which differences in sectoral productivity in the two jurisdictions are explained by differences in the amounts of factors that should ultimately determine productivity. So for example, having a highly educated workforce, and so on. And we know that many of the drivers of productivity, be it education or other labor market variables, that they're all potentially responsive to policy. So a key aspect of this project was to construct a sectoral database for Ireland and for Northern Ireland. So we need granular data on productivity at a sectoral level that is both consistent across jurisdictions and over time. The measure of productivity that we're looking at in this work is output per worker, so gross value added per worker. So we constructed a data set that then includes 23 sectors, and that runs from 98 to 2020. So we've more than 500 observations for both Ireland and Northern Ireland. Although later on we do have to aggregate some sectors in the modelling work. In terms of key data sources for Ireland, all the data primarily comes from either Eurostat or the CSO. So we use national accounts data, labour force survey data, trade data, and gross fixed capital formation or investment data. For Northern Ireland, we use comparable data sources, primarily from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. So we're drawing on data from the regional accounts, the workforce jobs by industry and region, and the ONS also have regional estimates of gross fixed capital formation. And then many of the explanatory variables that we have, the things that we will put in, that the factors we believe that will ultimately drive productivity, especially on the labor market side, are extracted at a sectoral level from micro level labor force survey data. So for example, data on the education composition of the workforce, as well as demographic factors related to migration, contractual status, and so on. So we know for Ireland, we know that there are some multinational dominated sectors whereby recorded activity or output can be disconnected from actual trends. So that essentially it overstates output in certain sectors. So we exclude sectors that have a very heavy multinational presence in Ireland from both the data for Ireland and for Northern Ireland. So I've listed here the sectors that we're excluding, and they're the ones you'd probably expect. So like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, information and communication, and so on. They're all listed there on the slide. How much do these exclusions matter? Well, for Ireland, these sectors account for 45% of output, but only 10% of employment. So we're excluding we're capturing most Irish employment but we're dropping a lot of the output. But these sectors account for 9% of output and 7% of employment in Northern Ireland. So we're capturing most recorded activity in Northern Ireland. And just to be clear, there is still multinational activity in the data for both jurisdictions. But what we've done is we've excluded the multinational dominated sectors that tend to really distort Irish output. So this graph just shows output growth in Ireland over time, with and without these sectors included. And the solid line is the one that excludes them. And it shows that the major distortions that were most evident in the 2015 national accounts are gone. Later on maybe just move to the next slide. So first, looking first of all at the aggregate data, if we exclude the sectors that distort Ireland's output data, this dampens productivity levels in Ireland. So when we include these sectors, it comes out at over €145,000 per worker. When we exclude them, productivity is 88,000 per worker. Excluding these sectors, though, has a much more limited impact on productivity in Northern Ireland. So it's €55,000 per worker and down to just €54,000 per worker with these sectors excluded. So it has a very limited impact on the productivity data for Northern Ireland. However, and I suppose this is the important point, the gap in productivity levels between Ireland and Northern Ireland is substantial, with productivity or output per worker being €88,000 per worker in Ireland and just under 54,000 in Northern Ireland. And this table also shows annual average productivity growth between 98 and 2020. And overall productivity growth in Ireland has averaged around 0.2% per annum. So it's been, trending upwards slightly, while productivity has actually fallen in Northern Ireland, average fall of around 1.2% per annum over the same time period. So the stronger Irish growth over time indicates a divergence in productivity levels between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is essentially what we show here. So on Ireland in this graph is in blue, Northern Ireland is in red. And if you looked at the left-hand side of the chart in around 2000, we can see that productivity levels in the two regions were broadly equivalent in 2000. And then over the period 2001 to 2020, while productivity levels in Ireland in blue have been trending slightly upwards, in Northern Ireland, productivity levels have been trending downwards. So by 2020, productivity per worker was around 40% higher in Ireland compared to Northern Ireland. This graph shows productivity by sector in Ireland and Northern Ireland for 2019. And I think we're looking at around 17 sectors here. And what the graph shows is that across the sectors, Northern Ireland has higher levels of productivity in electricity and gas supply and in construction, while Ireland has higher levels of productivity in the other sectors. So this graph just shows the same information, but in terms of the magnitude of sectoral productivity gaps. And we can see that there are large gaps in favor of Ireland in admin and support services activities, finance and insurance activities, legal and accounting, and scientific R&D. Just to make the point here as well is that later on in the modelling work, as a robustness check, we do exclude other sectors where recorded productivity may be artificially high. So for some of those where we see the really big gap. And just to make the point that our model results are robust to these exclusions. So this table has the productivity model results for Ireland. So we look at the two countries separately. So for Ireland, in terms of key productivity driving explanatory variables, we include the sectoral share of workers with lower secondary, upper secondary, post-secondary and third level qualifications, as well as investment. We also include controls for contractual status, the share of part-time workers, the sectoral share of migrants and gender, as well as some measures of worker underutilization, as these controls are frequently observed to be correlated with wages. And we know that productivity and wages are highly interdependent, so it's plausible that these factors may also influence productivity. So looking first at the model on the left-hand side, overall the model conforms to expectations, with sectoral productivity increasing with the level of investment and with the share of educated workers. We don't find impacts with regard to gender, migrant employment, underemployment, or contractual status. So with respect to education, the model suggests that a 1% increase in the share of graduates employed generates a 1% increase in sectoral productivity. And the productivity impacts of a 1% increase in the share of workers educated to upper secondary level is at 1.4, post-secondary at 1.1. And then a 1% increase in investment generates a 0.2% increase in productivity. And there's also some weak evidence that an increase in the share of part-time workers boosts productivity. And then in the right-hand side, we report the results for a model that's just restricted to exporting sectors. So the sample size here is smaller, as this data was only available for a more limited time period. And also there's some sectors that don't export. So overall, the model is highly consistent with what we have estimated on the larger sample, again, with sectoral productivity positively related to the share of educated workers, although the impacts here are much stronger. Similar result for investment. And as well, we find that a 1% increase in exports leads to around a 0.12% increase in productivity. It's important to note that we don't have sectoral level data on things like FDI or expenditure on R&D. We just didn't have this data that we need over time for measures like that. But these things will all be correlated with exports. So we are kind of indirectly controlling or including them in our model. So here we have the results for the Northern Ireland model. And here we're using comparable data sources and the same estimation technique and so on. But overall, the results are statistically much weaker compared to what we have for the Ireland model. So in the model for all sectors, the one on the left-hand side, only the control variables measuring the share of part-time workers and the sectoral share of migrants are significant. The impact of workers being educated to third level is statistically significant, but the results are counterintuitive. They suggest that productivity levels actually fall with the higher the share of graduates in employment. So that's counterintuitive. And then when we move to the model on the right-hand side, just focuses on the exporting sectors, basically everything drops out. So, you know, the overall F statistic indicates that we can't reject the hypothesis that the model coefficients are jointly zero, or I suppose in layman's terms that, you know, nothing is coming, none of the usual drivers of productivity, education, investment, exports are coming through as important. And I think it's concerning that we don't observe these sort of standard relationships between education and productivity, or investment and productivity for Northern Ireland. We then use a separate modelling approach, an OACA decomposition, to measure the extent to which differences in productivity levels in the two jurisdictions are explained by differences in their endowments of key factors, the amounts they have of key factors that drive productivity, and other factors. So on average over the period, productivity levels in Ireland were just below 30% higher than those of Northern Ireland. So what we do here is we basically take the Irish productivity model and we re-estimate it using Northern Ireland endowment levels. And that analysis shows that the gap in productivity can be explained by differences in investment and in labour market endowments, specifically the share of workers educated to post-secondary level between the two regions. So it's much lower in Northern Ireland. So I suppose by way of summary and for conclusions, what we found in this research is that productivity levels in the two regions were broadly equivalent in 2000. Over the period 2001 to 2020, productivity levels in Ireland have trended slightly upwards, while in Northern Ireland, productivity levels have been trending downwards. By 2020, productivity per worker was around 40% higher in Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Our econometric model for Ireland performs well, with sectoral productivity increasing with levels of investment and also the employment share of educated workers. We also find that export intensity is an important factor in driving Irish productivity. However, despite using comparable data sources and the same estimation method, we find no evidence of a relationship between the range of factors captured in the model, education, investment, exports, etc., and Northern Ireland productivity. There's no obvious explanations for the absence of relationship between productivity and these factors in Northern Ireland. It's possible that potential factors explaining this could relate to the impact of the Troubles, a relatively closed economy in terms of international trade, peripherality, limited results from regional policy, and a historical reliance on public sector employment. But for this, we can only really, we can't point to what the factors are. This is sort of speculation on our part. But overall then, such an outcome raises questions around the underlying competitiveness of the Northern Irish economy and how it responds to changes in what are generally considered to be key policy levers. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then our decomposition measures the extent to which differences in productivity levels in the two jurisdictions are explained by differences in their endowments of key factors that should ultimately drive productivity and other factors. And then on average over the period, productivity levels in Ireland were just below 30% higher than those of Northern Ireland. And essentially all of this gap can be explained by differences in investment and in labour market endowments, in particular, the share of workers educated to post-secondary level between the two jurisdictions. So overall, we feel our analysis points to the need to rapidly expand investment and to improve skills in Northern Ireland, particularly at the post-secondary level. However, our models also suggest that without a comprehensive strategy aimed at improving competitiveness among firms in Northern Ireland, the reform of education and skills provision and increasing investment by themselves or in isolation are not guaranteed to enhance productivity in Northern Ireland. And it may be the case that there are other economic, social, and political factors that need to be considered in devising an appropriate policy response. So thank you for listening, and we will pass over. We have Dr. David Jordan from Queen's will discuss the report.
Thank you very much, Adele. Let me just share my screen here, and thank you very much for the opportunity as well today to be the discussant for this very interesting report as well. So the main sort of three contributions I sort of want to highlight, which I think we can sort of take away from this report. Firstly, it furthers our understanding of the North-South differences in productivity. So obviously, as Adele mentioned, we know quite a lot about Northern Ireland relative to regions in the rest of the UK, but there's been a lot less work on the differences North-South on this island. So this report really adds to that work. Obviously, one of the main difficulties when comparing productivity North-South is this issue of multinationals and the distortionary effects that we see because of their accounting practices. So this report does a good job of trying to control for that effect and to try and sort of take that away so we can actually see what the underlying differences are. And I think the fact that 14 of the 17 comparable sectors, productivity is much higher in 14 in Ireland compared to Northern Ireland, demonstrates that low productivity in Northern Ireland is a very widespread issue. It's not related to a particular area of the economy. It's something that's spread right throughout the economy as well. And part of this, obviously, there's a little bit of a structural effect. The structure of the Northern Ireland economy is slightly different, but I was interested to see, actually looking at the relative structures of Ireland and Northern Ireland, this effect probably isn't as large as it is comparing Northern Ireland to regions in Great Britain and the rest of the UK. So it suggests that a lot of the differences in productivity are within sectors as well. The second sort of main contribution I sort of want to highlight of the report is the fact it offers a new perspective on Northern Ireland's low productivity, but also its causes as well. Probably the most sort of important thing or concerning thing almost in the report is the fact that real productivity growth has been negative for Northern Ireland. I think that's a very important thing to highlight. If you go back to 1998 and then we sort of run through Northern Ireland's performance since then, we've seen quite strong growth in number of jobs, but we haven't seen output matching that growth in jobs. And that appears to be one of the areas where Northern Ireland is falling behind. So post-Troubles, it's done quite well in terms of increasing employment, but this hasn't been matched by these new jobs being in high productivity areas. So that's a potential concern. And as well, I think related to that is the fact the statistical models don't show the strong relationships between sort of traditional drivers of productivity and Northern Ireland's performance, particularly the negative effect of graduate employment, it appears, on productivity. And I think that reinforces the message that there's a big questions about the underlying competitiveness of Northern Ireland's economy. And the third sort of contribution I want to highlight is the fact it really does highlight the scale of the challenge in raising productivity in Northern Ireland. The fact that it isn't being driven by the same factors as what we see in Ireland suggests that at the moment, the Northern Irish economy is maybe functioning in a slightly different way, and that there are other barriers to productivity growth. So it suggests we need to try and understand what those other barriers are before we can sort of apply a policy solution to that as well. Just to give a little bit of context about Northern Ireland compared to regions in Great Britain, this graph is showing GVA per hour worked compared to the UK level, which is equal to 100. And we can see that Northern Ireland is the worst performing region in the UK very consistently. It did briefly overtake Wales in 2016, but otherwise it has been much lower overall. If we were to sort of roughly put where Ireland is on this graph, it would be about the 115 to 120 mark. So it has a higher level of productivity than the UK and quite a lot higher than Northern Ireland. One other thing just to remember about Northern Ireland is the fact there is a regional component as well within Northern Ireland. So productivity in Belfast is only about 5% below the UK level, but in other places like Derry City and Strabane, it's about 23% below the UK level. So there's quite a lot of disparity as well within Northern Ireland. So I'm just going to take the opportunity just to speculate a little bit about the other potential explanations for this low productivity. So at the Northern Ireland Productivity Forum, based at Queen's Management School, we've been sort of starting to explore some of the other reasons that might exist for low productivity in Northern Ireland. And of course, this report demonstrates that quite clearly the traditional drivers of productivity, so education, investment, export intensity, don't appear to be so positively improving productivity in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to sort of focus on 3 of the potential explanations suggested in the report and what we might sort of initially think about these as explanations for the productivity gap. Firstly, there's the issue of skills. So we can see in the report, the Northern Ireland economy appears unresponsive to increases in education. And traditionally, Northern Ireland has suffered from 2 key sort of problems related to education. So we have the brain drain, where we have a lot of graduate level people leaving Northern Ireland or going to study in Great Britain for university, and then they don't come back. And we also have an attainment gap, where we have a high proportion of the population with low or no skills. And this graph on the right shows the fact that in terms of low and no skills, Northern Ireland has the highest proportion amongst UK regions for this measure. But interestingly, recently, the graduate level employment, or this tertiary level, this situation has improved. So actually, Northern Ireland has started to move much closer to the UK average. And this has really just been in the past 4 or 5 years. So in 2016, about 30% had tertiary education in Northern Ireland. Now in 2021, it's just over 40%. However, it doesn't seem to be sort of equally distributed in terms of post-secondary and graduate level. So we have a lot of graduate level people in the workforce, but we may be missing out on post-secondary. So this has an issue in terms of the appropriateness of skills, as the report highlights. We may not have a workforce with the right skills to match up with what the private sector needs to drive productivity growth. And there's also the potential issue of a management skills gap. So this is something we're exploring with a project at the Productivity Forum. And it's the question of whether or not firms in Northern Ireland have the right skills within management to drive productivity, that there could be a skills gap, and this could be contributing to the productivity gap. The troubles and the size of the public sector is another potential explanation, and they're sort of interrelated, so I've grouped them here together. So we know the troubles had a quite large direct impact on the Northern Ireland economy. So it reduced GDP per capita by around 10%, and also saw policymakers trying to balance economic and non-economic considerations. So they weren't always thinking about productivity. They were often thinking about trying to stabilize the economy and the total level of employment instead. But we do know that weaknesses existed in Northern Ireland's economy even before the Troubles. So this graph on the right-hand side shows productivity in Northern Ireland over the past 100 years or so, and even back to 1912 for the counties that would become Northern Ireland as well. And we can see this productivity gap has been a very persistent feature of the Northern Irish economy. There was a little bit of a catch-up in the 1960s, but more recently it has stabilized at this sort of 15 to 20% margin. It has been suggested that the large public sector is to blame by basically soaking up part of the skilled workforce and driving up wages. However, there is a counter argument to this, that it's really more about a weak private sector that's maybe contributing to low productivity. Particularly if you measure the size of the public sector on a per capita basis, actually it's not too much larger than Scotland, for example. So maybe it's more about a weak private sector. And there's the issue as well about economic inactivity and health. There's a legacy effect from the Troubles, and that affects the productivity of individuals in work as well. The final area I just want to highlight is about policy institutions, and I think this is potentially one of the big explanations for low productivity in Northern Ireland. So policy interventions do have quite a poor track record for improving productivity. In the past, there's been incorrect diagnosis of problems. There's very much a focus on capital levels and less on skills. There were poorly targeted subsidies. So often subsidies helped uncompetitive firms survive, and they continued to produce low value outputs. And Northern Ireland has been a lot less successful than Ireland at attracting foreign direct investment. It simply hasn't managed to match Ireland's success story in this area. As well as policy, productivity has rarely been used as a measure of outcomes. So it's often aspiration of policymakers in Northern Ireland, but is less often used to measure the outcomes of policy interventions. And also policy making has been highlighted as taking place in silos. To try and tackle productivity in Northern Ireland, it requires a very joined up approach. It covers a lot of different areas, but policy has been criticised for not joining up the different policy areas that are needed. And I think this brings me to the main takeaway from this report, which is the fact that I don't think there's any single cause of low productivity in Northern Ireland. And this suggests probably there's no single policy solution. We need to understand more about what drives low productivity in Northern Ireland if Northern Ireland is to emulate Ireland's success in this area. So that's the end of what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Fascinating response, I have to say, and fascinating presentation earlier on, Adele. So I should say to the audience, if people are interested, David's comments are available on the ESRI website, where you'll find the report today. You'll find David's comments, and I think you'll agree that they sort of complement very, very well. So encourage you to go and take a look. So if people want to submit questions through the Q&A function, they're welcome to do so, and I'll pass them on to the panelists. But I'm going to start off with a question or two myself, if I might. And again, this will go to Seamus, Adele, but David, you're very, very welcome to comment on this. I have to say, when I heard this report was being done, I had expected a productivity gap between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Okay, always interesting to see scale of the gap and everything like that, and that was important. What I hadn't expected to see, though, was this decline in productivity in Northern Ireland over the 20-year period. I mean, that was just one of those facts that struck me as quite extraordinary. And if we look at the narrative, like across the world, you'll hear issues around productivity stalling, but the notion that productivity was actually declining. And I'd just be curious if there's a stronger explanation. I mean, I presume it's some sort of a composition effect. And David, you touched on this in your remarks. I mean, I can't imagine individuals in some sense are getting less productive, or individual factories are getting less productive. But something happened, the evolution of the Northern Ireland economy over those 20 years or so, where you had this expansion in lower productivity jobs. So I don't know, Seamus, Adele, or David, if you want to take a stab at that, but just why did productivity fall? And was it a composition effect? And do we have any sort of sense of where the composition effect began? Seamus, do you want to kick off maybe?
Thanks, Alan. Extremely difficult question, I must say, but so there isn't a sense that there has been big compositional shifts necessarily in the structure of the Northern economy. But so in terms of where I would be looking at these issues are actually, the quality of jobs that have come onto the labour market in the last 20 years. And I think that's where we really have to look to, because obviously the nature and the quality of jobs will set a productivity constraint on workers, and we've done a lot of research in that in the area of mismatch. So even if you have more and more educated workers, if there are lower quality jobs replacing higher quality jobs over time, then productivity per worker will ultimately fall. Even though the educated workers can lift the productivity of those jobs a little bit, they never earn their full marginal product, as we say in economics, because the nature of the jobs constrains their productivity levels. So again, this was a surprise to me, to be honest. I would have expected to see constant productivity and slightly growing higher productivity in the Republic, and the gap not to be so large. But if I was to look at it anywhere, first of all, I'd be looking at job quality and how that's evolving over time in Northern Ireland.
Okay, thanks for that. David, do you want to have a stab at what Seamus described as a difficult question?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with Seamus with what he said there. And yeah, it was quite a surprise for me to see that as well. It wasn't really something I was fully aware of, that there's been this real terms decline. I think one way to think about it is the fact that if we're measuring since 1998, this is sort of the post-Good Friday Agreement economy for Northern Ireland. And it's basically seen one of the strongest job growths across UK regions since then. It's only been surpassed by London, I think, since 1998. So it does suggest that we're seeing plenty of new jobs have been created in the local economy, but they haven't had necessarily a high enough productivity level. And this may relate to policy, that maybe there's been a little bit of a hangover from the viewpoint that we need to create jobs, that unemployment is the biggest problem facing Northern Ireland's economy. But we now need to actually move into how do we create high productivity jobs? How do we create good jobs for people that take advantage of the skills that they have?
Yeah, no, fascinating. Let me go to some of the questions that are coming through on the Q&A function. So the first one, Rose Conway Walsh, TD, and thanks for joining us, Rose. So the question is, what is the reason for falls in productivity in relation to the increase in graduates? So I think that comes from one of the regressions, Seamus and Adele, where again, it's sort of a surprising result where it seems that graduates were negatively associated with productivity. Any hunches as to why that might have happened?
I might take that one, Alan.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for the question, Rose. I don't think it's a completely counterintuitive result. And so I think overall that the models that we have for Northern Ireland do not perform well. So I think rather than maybe trying to tie ourselves up and coming up with an answer for that one specific effect, I think I'd be happier saying the model for Northern Ireland, just the usual factors that drive productivity, we don't find evidence for them.
Okay, and just to sort of ignore your advice for a second, Adele, and to give a suggestion, I mean, could it be that third level graduates are being attracted into, say, public sector occupations, which might be less productive? Anything like that, or am I wasting time here by hypothesizing?
I can take that. I mean, it is a fixed effects model. It's the most robust sort of estimation we can get using these panel methodologies. It was surprising to see the negative effect, but if I suppose you have an increase in the number of graduates and falling job quality, that could account for a negative relationship between the two. And there is this issue, compositional issue on the supply side, that really the vocational sector looks to be very poorly equipped in Northern Ireland in terms of the post-compulsory education and training component, so that the FE bit, and we've seen this with our other research. So there may be well an issue there as well in terms of there's not enough people with the right skills going into the labour market, particularly vocational skills at just below the graduate level. So that again is pushing, if you're pushing graduates into more and more graduates into lower quality jobs, I think that's potentially why we get a negative effect.
Okay, another question here, and this is from John Campbell. And again, John, thanks for joining us. So I'll read this one out because, as ever, it's slightly tricky. In terms of the exclusion of sectors, might that have excluded the measurement of real productivity growth in key Northern Ireland sectors? And John lists aviation, pharma, and construction equipment manufacturing. So, you know, the impact, are we painting an overly negative picture of Northern Ireland as a result of those exclusions? So again, one for Seamus and Adele.
Thanks for the question, John. I don't think so. So our motivation for excluding these sectors was we know that these sectors that output for Ireland is artificially high, and so we really needed to strip them out from the Irish data so that we'd be compare, and then so that we could then compare like with like, we had to strip them out of Northern Irish data. But having said that, though, productivity, if aggregate productivity in Northern Ireland, with all of those sectors in, looking at the entire spectrum of sectors in Northern Ireland, at an aggregate level, it was €55,000 per worker. When we exclude them, it has very limited impact on aggregate productivity in Northern Ireland. It goes to just under €54,000. So it actually, at an aggregate level, has very limited impact on productivity in Northern Ireland.
And if I could just add, actually, you know, when we excluded the multinational sectors from the Irish data, you know, we stripped out 45% of GVA there, and there was a lot of genuine GVA and a lot of genuine productivity within that. It isn't all false accounting. So if the bias is going in any direction, it's probably we may well be underestimating the nature of the gap.
Okay, actually, there's another question here from John Campbell, that is, and I'm going to ask this one because it was something that struck me, and you might want to tease through it. Okay, so you have one modelling exercise for Northern Ireland that says that none of the sort of the conventional factors seem to be impacting on productivity. Okay, but when you do the decomposition exercise, there is a conclusion there that, well, you know, if you had more education and more investment, this would be good for Northern. So there's almost like a mini contradiction there, an apparent contradiction. I'm sure there isn't. But do you want to take John's question and just explain what's going on there?
I can do that, Adele, if you want. So the decomposition exercise, the explain component of the decomposition, John, is to take the differences in the endowment, so the differences in education and capital stock between the two regions, and you effectively multiply them by the coefficient effects. Now you can do that either using the coefficient effects for Ireland or the coefficient effects for Northern Ireland. The rest of the stuff goes into the explain component. So effectively for the coefficient for this decomposition, what we were doing, we were using the coefficients from the Irish model for the decomposition approach, because they are the ones that were statistically sound and significant. So effectively, what we were doing was feeding the endowment levels of Northern Ireland into the Irish model. We were seeing how much productivity dropped, and we were then measuring that against the total fall. And so what we see is when you do that, the total fall that we get is totally explained by the differences in the endowment levels. So what's done by feeding the Northern Ireland data into the model coefficients for Ireland. I hope that is a reason.
Yeah, I'd say John will email you after this if it didn't make sense. Another question from Rose Conway Walsh, and we're back to the brain drain discussion. Always, it seems to me, comes up when we discuss productivity in Northern Ireland. Rose's specific question is, and sort of beyond the scope of this report, but do we know anything about students coming to the south as opposed to Great Britain? I think a lot of the discussion always sort of seems to be about students in Northern Ireland going to GB. But do we know how many come down south? I don't know, David, if you have any sort of sense of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the specific figure. I do know for those who go south, it is much lower than for those who would have gone to GB. So I think there was a statistic from work by John Fitzgerald, which suggested that 1/3 of graduates born in Northern Ireland currently live and work in Great Britain. So it has been a very big effect in the past, though there has been some work by the Ulster Economic Policy Centre, which has shown this brain drain has reduced substantially. But I'm not sure of how many go south, but it's always been historically much lower.
Sure. Okay, thanks for that. Question here from Mark Curran. What measures are the Northern Ireland party's politicians taking to address this gap? And are there strategies, policies in the pipeline? So I don't know, David, if you want to kick off on that one, and then we can go back to policy innovation in Northern Ireland in this area.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The Department for Economy has recently launched its 10x sort of strategy for policy to try and improve the performance of the local economy. And for the first time, it has sort of tried to focus a bit more on productivity, not only the aspiration to improve it, but actually they're going to try and measure some of the policy outcomes with productivity measures. They are focusing a lot on trying to support high productivity sectors, though there is the question of, if we just focus on quite small sectors, will that be enough to drive up productivity in the overall economy if we see quite low productivity in other sectors? So there have been some recent policy sort of proposals, but also we're yet to see what the outcome might be.
Okay, and actually, I'm going to put it's a related question, Seamus, so I just put it to you. So a lot made of investment in this report, okay, and I take it from what you were saying that that's private sector investment, it's businesses in business, but was there anything in the report, did you think about this at all, like public investment? Okay, because it sort of strikes me, if you look at this literature internationally, a sort of a growing sense that both public institutions, but public investment matters enormously. And that's everything from the traditional stuff such as road infrastructure and rail and airports, all that sort of stuff. But it's also R&D expenditure, science spending, all of those sort of things. So anything in the report about public investment, or do you have a sense how that might actually matter?
Well, I suppose because this is a sectoral model, it would be not possible for us to build that in, because obviously you would have to account and split the public investment by sector, so it wouldn't be possible. For other factors such as R&D and FDI, we scoured every source that was available, and we just didn't have any of that data available to sort of fill in. But going back to the policy discussion, I think there's a few colleagues, former colleagues from Northern Ireland online, and I think one of the issues is around policies to support entrepreneurship. I mean, when we look back, when I was working in Belfast, and we had LEDU was there particularly to support the small the SME sector, and particularly innovation around that. You'd have to then raise questions about the FDI strategy and how successful that has been, as we're seeing falling sort of per worker productivity. And then the point that David made earlier, I think, is very important, in that because of how policy is set up in Northern Ireland, you do have departments working in silos. So it's not necessarily that there's any real cross-cutting strategies to sort of connect everything up in terms of a joined up productivity and competitiveness policy approach.
Okay, thanks. And actually, we did get a question from an anonymous attendee, so I can't say who it is. But this issue: what is your sense of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship policy in the two jurisdictions? You touched on that a bit. Well, I suppose you talked, David, about managerial competence and stuff like that. So I suppose often is there a link between entrepreneurship and managerial competence? So is that something you've been thinking about?
Yeah, so we've been doing a project at the moment about management skills. To try and understand this management gap. Do management in firms in Northern Ireland have the right skills? Because a lot of policy over the past 20 years has focused very much on the entrepreneurship side. There's been a big drive to try and provide resources for those who may be starting a business. And this has been a big focus of policy. However, potentially the issue of medium-sized firms has maybe been forgotten. That those firms have to grow from being small to medium, and that can be part of potentially the productivity issue, that as a firm grows, it's maybe falling behind where it might otherwise be. So entrepreneurship has been a big focus. It's still a little bit lower in Northern Ireland than elsewhere in the UK, but I think there are other questions about management skills as well.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a lot of other questions actually coming in, which we're not going to be able to get to, I'm afraid. But one at a sort of a more local was a local within, or the productivity difference between Belfast and Londonderry is also stark. And what is the biggest contributor to this? So I don't know, David, can you comment on that? The sort of within Northern Ireland productivity differential.
It's a very stark difference, and it's quite a complex problem, I think. Belfast performs well because it is sort of a centre of economic activity for Northern Ireland. It has the benefit of these agglomeration effects simply from its scale, and some of the larger businesses are located in Belfast. Also, Mid-Ulster is very strong for productivity. It's basically the second area in Northern Ireland, and that's related to its manufacturing base. But when we look to the northwest, for Derry, Londonderry, the surrounding area, Strabane, we're not entirely sure what the reasons are. They're probably related partially to economic inactivity, a lack of skills, and trying to promote investment as well. But it's going to be a very complicated problem to try and work out what the key parts are and how to address it as well.
Sure, thanks. And I should have said that question was for Fiona Corvin. So thanks for that, Fiona. Now I'm looking at my clock, and unfortunately, I said at the outset that we would have a sort of a relatively snappy, short webinar. And since people have planned on that, I'm sort of reluctant to drift over. But just judging by the sort of questions, a huge amount of interest and a lot of thought going into this. So when the ESRI previously did a report on looking at education and training in Northern Ireland and Ireland, we did a webinar like this, but we also did an in-person event in Belfast to sort of keep that sort of discussion going. And don't want to put you on the spot, David, but we might come back to you and see might it be possible to connect with yourself and Queen's, or maybe the colleagues in UU or whatever, and we might consider doing another event, because there's a lot of discussion, and I think it is one of those areas where the sort of the possibility of mutual learning is very, very strong. Okay, so listen, we're close to midday, so I just want to thank, obviously, Adele and Seamus again for a fantastic report and a very good presentation this morning. Thanks to you as well, David, for giving so much thought to your response. Very, very much appreciated all that. Thanks to everybody who attended, and especially those who submitted questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them, but as I said, I think this is a conversation that will continue. So with that, I'll just bid everybody goodbye and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.